let's go over the data and the news for this week. First on the data, core data that came out this week include December PPI, December core CPI, weekly initial jobless claims, and December retail sales. Now, let's look at the data one by one. The month-over-month PPI for December came out this week, which showed a modest trend compared to the CPI and core CPI and other inflation-related data, which came out over the course of last month. Now, PPI measures the change in the price of goods sold by manufacturers, and therefore, it somewhat relates to the ISM manufacturing data, which we reviewed 2 weeks ago. If you look at this table, month-over-month PPI increased by 0.2%, which was lower than the forecast of 0.4%. and previous months of 0.4%. Now, this means that the price of manufactured goods are not increasing as much as the market expected. Now, this is quite understandable considering that the manufacturing data, including the ISM manufacturing index, showed a weak trend of below 50 in recent months. While it is a good sign that the inflation is probably somewhat controlled versus expectations, it does puzzle me that the market interprets this as a positive sign with the market going up, given it is a natural outcome from the ISM data. Nonetheless, the market interpreted this data as a positive trend on the inflation. Next major data that came out was the December core CPI and CPI data. Now, this data is what everyone was waiting for, as this is directly related to the inflation trend, which is also strongly correlated to the Federal Reserve's interest rate cut decision. Now, let's look at the core CPI data first. Now, as I mentioned last month, core CPI index is important because it removes volatile items like food and energy, and it provides a more stable measure of inflation trend, which helps the central bank design future policies to achieve a target inflation rate. Now, core CPI for December increased by 0.2% on a month-over-month basis, which was lower than the forecast of 0.3% and also lower than the previous month of 0.3%. Now, the market reacted extremely positively on this news, given it seemingly means that the inflation is now being controlled. However, when you look at the composition of the CPI, I don't know if it's something that the market should be crazy about. Basically, the reason core CPI, which is all items less food and energy, showed a positive trend is really because of the items right here, which are new vehicles, used cars, and trucks and apparel. Now, car sales have been suffering for a long time, and as you can see in the table, price of used cars and trucks fluctuates quite a bit depending on market situations. It goes as high as 2.7% and goes as low as minus 2.3%. I said this multiple times in my previous video, but the most important component in this table is the shelter, which is the most sticky component of the core CPI. If you look at shelter, it is still at 0.3%, which is in line versus the previous month, which still poses a real challenge for the market to control the inflation. Therefore, it is my view that while the market may be going all crazy and happy about the CPI, we still have a long way to go. I mentioned this earlier, but unless there's a meaningful housing price crash, the inflation will stay high for longer. Now, despite the core CPI showing a positive trend, the CPI on a year-on-year basis showed an inline trend versus the forecast, and also higher compared to the previous month. Therefore, this also shows that the inflation is still far from being fully controlled. Now, as I mentioned in my previous videos, the Federal Reserve's target CPI is currently at around 2%, which means that the Fed will do something, either slowing the interest rate cut or decreasing the Federal Reserve balance sheet to lower the inflation to their target level. The inflation rate has been extremely sticky and not going down further from around 2.5 to 3%, which still poses a real challenge for the Federal Reserve. I repeat that I think this will continue to be the case in the midterm unless a big correction in the housing market happens, leading to a decrease in the overall rent and housing prices. The next major data that was announced was the weekly initial jobless claims data. As you can see in the table this week, the weekly initial jobless claims was at 217,000, which was higher than the forecast of 210,000, and was also higher than the previous week of 203,000. Now, this is a positive trend after many weeks of disappointments. Now, as I repeat from last week, a higher initial jobless claims compared to the forecasts means that the job market is bad, which gives the Federal Reserve more means to lower the interest rate. This week, after many weeks of disappointments, this happened, which the market also interpreted as a positive sign. Next major data that was announced was the month-over-month US retail sales. The data measures the change in the sales of retail goods, which acts as a good indicator for consumer spending. In December, the retail sales increased by 0.4% compared to the forecast of 0.6% and lower than the previous month of 0.8%. Now, given the holiday season, the market expected the retail sales to increase by a lot, but it was lower than the expectations, which seemingly implies that the consumer spent less during the holiday season. Now, let's move on to some commentaries on the market based on what happened during the week. Market was generally up during the week, with S&P going up by around 2.9% and Nasdaq rising by 2.5%. As I mentioned before, the main reason for the boost in the market was mainly led by the positive core CPI data, which came out earlier this week. The positive core CPI data basically led the investors to think that the interest rate cut may happen sooner than later, given the inflation may be somewhat controlled. However, I think the market is overreacting for three reasons. Number one, the market has been on a downward trend for almost a month straight, and therefore a week of recovery is a natural trend wherever the market is headed in the future. And number two, as I mentioned previously, the most important component in the core CPI is still the shelter, and housing prices are still showing a strong trend. The core CPI may turn towards a negative trend anytime soon. Number three, I believe the market was overestimating the December CPI and retail sales trend based on the previous year's trend, which was hugely impacted by the pent-up demand coming out of COVID-19. Therefore, a better trend versus expectations may not mean so much. Now finally, let's take a look at the Federal Reserve policy table to get a sense of where we are. While we're currently in Section C, gradually heading towards Section D, the data which came out this week may put a bit of weight towards the direction shifting again towards Section C. However, as I mentioned previously, we need to monitor the trend for a few more months before reaching a definitive conclusion. We'll see what spans out in the next few weeks. I'll be back with another set of market update next week.